Hi there. Welcome back to 19th century art. In this lecture, we're going to look at Francisco Goya, and we're going to begin our investigation of a new art movement called Romanticism. The ideas of the sublime and the grotesque are really important concepts in this notion of Romanticism. And while Goya would not have called himself a romantic artist, he definitely was working in a vein that was in contrast to what we've been looking at so far, which is the neoclassical traditions of the early 19th century. Romanticism really worked in opposition to those ideas that beauty needed to be idealized to be understood, and instead looked toward the strange, the peculiar, the extraordinary, as a way into our understanding what is truly amazing and wonderful and terrifying about being a human being. Francisco Goya, we see here a self-portrait at the peak of his career in 1790. You'll see him painting in the clothing of a Mayo. He is proudly proclaiming himself to be Spanish. And unlike many of the court that would dress in French clothing, he was a Spaniard through and through, and he showed this off in this clothing of this people of the upper middle class Spaniards who wanted to define themselves in opposition to the prevailing court tastes, which were French neoclassicism. Spain was, at a time, a very hostile country still. It was deeply racked by religious persecution, and there were not the same kind of schools of thought that were generating the Enlightenment as we saw in France and in Britain. You'll notice here, Goya lived to be 82 years old. This is an incredible long life at a time in Spain when the average life expectancy was below 30 years of age. So he was very much a Methuselah, a man who lived almost 3 times what most people were going to do. And so when we talk about his life, I have to sort of skim through the high points. You must understand there's an extraordinary richness to his life as an artist. He begins as a court painter to the Tapestry Guild, where he would be creating designs known as cartoons, the preliminary material by which tapestries would then be woven from, and then they would be hung inside these court palaces. And they went through them, and they had new ones made all the time to fit the passing fancy. And so they could be on romantic themes or themes like you see here, these women playing a game where they're tossing this doll of a man up in the air, sort of a parable for women toying with men and their love interests. But this is where Goya begins to learn how to create intriguing stories, how he can create drama and action and interest in his stories. And while it is still very crude in a way, Goya would never be a great masterful painter. He becomes a really exceptional storyteller. Look, for example, at this later work here, The Wedding from 1792, in this tapestry cartoon. It's truly a masterful act of storytelling. This wedding is taking place in a very unconventional place, in a dry creek bed below a bridge. There's a wagon there a kid is standing on. We see in the center of the screen the bride and the groom, and they seem very mismatched. The bride is quite lovely in her dress, and the groom looks wealthy, but he has a really ugly mug. So he's probably a man who's come into his wealth suddenly, has gone back to the village, and he's picked up a pretty bride for himself. We see the bride's father ushering in the pastor who's coming in a hasty way. This has all been done very ad hoc in a quick way. They're quickly selling off their daughter. The daughter's gotten so quickly dressed So she's wearing her shoes on the wrong feet. You can look down at her feet and you can see that. So there's these wonderful telling examples of how Goya is looking at real life. He's looking at people, ordinary people, their greed. This is not a romantic scene in the sense of, oh, true love sight. Romance in this is actually looking at the darker and seedier sides of human character, where we are petty and self-obsessed. And this way, Goya is a tremendous social critic. He's also willing to look at some pretty dark pictures. He made a tapestry here of a robbery of a coach, and we can see dead on the ground the coachman. A rape is taking place, and the royals who have been spared so far are pleading for their life, promising to give ransom if they should be spared. And so this is a really dark tapestry cartoon that Goya has made here. And to the people that he's doing these things, this is the kind of images that they were living with. This was a very real danger that they had to experience. And so his honesty is something, a kind of freshness that they appreciated. So sometime between late 1792 and early 1793, some kind of undiagnosed illness left Goya deaf. He became withdrawn, introspective, and he really struggled to try and find his way again. The tone of his work changes. It becomes darker. He does a series of paintings of lunatic asylums. Here, this yard with lunatics is an example of this darker frame of art where we see them fighting and brawling and making a scene. And the sort of mayhem of humanity is something that he seems to become more fascinated by. What made him ill? It may have been the toxicity of the paints. It may have been something else that was lingering in his environment that affected him. But he continued, he comes back into the royal fold, and he's able to continue to do royal portraits. And this is where he gains most of his notoriety and fame throughout his life. Here we see an example of a very large painting of the entire royal family. Now, I have to be frank here. This is not an exceptional painting. Goya has done a fine job with the clothing and the faces and the bodies, but there's something essentially sort of rough about it. It doesn't show his nuance, his character. The people here look ordinary, plain. They don't seem to be anything other than who they are. And many people have commented on this painting how the king looks a little bit like a simpleton, and everyone looks a little bit bland. You'll notice the kind of French tastes and culture that they are presenting in this picture. Now, Goya has painted himself into this picture as well. And you'll see in the background there this little leaning canvas, and he's painted himself sort of looking into the frame. Now, this is a conceit done by a very famous painter almost 200 years earlier. And what he's done is try and sort of reference that great master work. We look at this painting. This is Las Minas by Diego Velázquez. You see Velázquez there is painting himself into this picture. And what he's doing is he's showing us that he's looking and painted a mirror of what he's seeing. And he's captured these figures not as he is seeing them directly, but as they are reflected in a mirror. And the mirror is the frame of our painting. So what we're seeing is not a painting of them, a painting of a reflection of them. This is an amazing painting. Velázquez is clearly an incredible artist. And Goya was deeply influenced by him and spent many years imitating and copying his masterworks that he had access to in the royal palaces as a way to improve his craft. One of his great patrons was Manuel Godoy, who was a very important minister at court, and here he is painting him in a more Spanish style, and he is certainly a man who would appreciate it. the unique take that Goya gave to his subjects. And in a very flattering way, he's making out his patron to be a man of great taste and culture and power. Godoy had him paint many pictures for him. At court, Goya becomes absolutely smitten by the Duchess of Alba, who is recently widowed, and he seems to have painted this picture for her. She is now a recent widow who's still quite young. She's on the hunt for a new husband. It's been speculated that Goya and she had an affair, but it's highly unlikely. This woman, who is very status conscious, would have been interested in a deaf painter as a lover. And though in this picture, you see her fiercely posing with her finger pointing down to the ground, she's pointing to a inscription in the sand which says, "Solo Goya," only Goya. We can only imagine this is what Goya wished she would say. So here's a painting that Goya made for Godoy, his patron, and he had two versions of this made. This one here, where we have the clothed Maya, and the Maya here again means the Spanish beauty, the female version of what he is dressed in, and now the naked Maya. And depending on who was coming over to visit, the Godoy would have one painting showing or the other. Because this was a time when the Inquisition could haul you in front of a court and ask why you have these sexual paintings in your house. And so it was very careful about who you showed what work to. Now, Godoy was pushing for reforms that would create a more liberal society and distance the courts from the church. It seems Goya was trying to enter into that conversation of creating a more secular society. So he created a series of etchings called Los Caprichos. And in this, which was probably intended to be the title page of this series, is called "The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters." Now, the exact meaning of that phrase is not entirely clear. Does that mean that when reason sleeps, when reason goes away, then we have monsters? Or is it that reason produces, when reason itself creates its own kind of monsters, meaning that the natural process of reason, or living this rational world, also has in it this monstrous imagination? So we see in this a whole series of extraordinary engravings. And these are aquatints with this sort of gray tone, and these are prints that he made for sale. Women are beating and making fun of men who are looking like plucked chickens. We see a child getting beaten for having broken a pitcher. We see a jackass teacher teaching a jackass student. And the phrase is, "How can the pupil know more?" And so in this, he's really pointing to human arrogance and cruelty and ignorance. He also goes into superstition. And here we see witches, and we see demons, and we see people, worshiping a parrot, which is showing them some kind of mysteries and inculcating them into this world of secret knowledge. All of this was things that he was very critical of and very skeptical of. And he was hoping that he could entreat people to buy this set of prints in order to speak about the problems of Spanish society at this time. But unfortunately, just as he was putting these out for sale, he quickly withdrew them and never put them out again. And again, it became one of those things, many things that Goya did in his life that would not be found or seen until after his death. And then, as we talked about before, France invades Spain. Napoleon comes in and his armies, and it's a brutal battle. This was painted after Napoleon's retreat in 1814, but the memory of these battles and the stories of these battles were fresh in Goya's mind. And you can see this is not a heroic battle. This is a melee, a tumult with peasants with daggers and pitchforks and these swordsmen, with their sabers slashing on the ground. It's a brutal, terrible battle. And so this is the 2nd of May, 1808. It's a very simple title, The Evidence of the Brutality. There's no heroism. There's no glory. There's no victory soon to be had. It's this brutal, nonsensical chaos. This is certainly the most powerful image that Goya would ever create in his entire life. The 3rd of May, the day after the war, when all the people who fought and resisted the French occupation were rounded up and shot mercilessly. And this line of soldiers, this brutal line of soldiers and their guns pointed directly, and the actions of the people pleading, surrendering to their fate. This is just a heart-rending scene that speaks to the humanity that was under threat with the brutality of the French invasion. It was during this time, when the French were in control, that Goya did not paint or work for the French court, but he worked in secret, creating a series of etchings about the disasters of war. The actual title of this, The Fatal Consequences of the Bloody War in Spain with Bonaparte. And they're heartrending. Here we see a father being pulled away from his family as the soldiers come charging up the hill. The man is trying to get him into the cover to hide, because he will be certainly killed if he stays out and tries to defend his family. The mother's picking up the baby, and there's this desperate plight of chaos. And the title for this is simply, I Saw This. And in this way, Goya is speaking to an experience of war that he clearly had. Now, to be fair, historians have looked very closely about where Goya was and where the battles were taking place, and it's not likely he actually saw something like this. But he very much saw people who did. And they were the ones who would tell him about what they saw. So he's like a reporter. He's giving us a picture of things that aren't being recorded any other way. He's giving us a glimpse of this terrible time in ways that nobody else was going to show. They do not want to hear the French soldier is raping a woman and an old woman comes to defend her with a dagger. I mean, the drama of this is just heartbreaking and so visceral and so real, the way she tears at his face. And then the tumult gets crazy. The woman turned upside down, the men grasping at her, trying to turn her. They tampoco, nor do these. They do not want this. And then, this is one of the most grotesque images Goya's made. This is worse. We see the soldier hacking people to pieces, and we see the evidence of the war crimes. In the end, he makes 2 prints. He writes, "Truth has died," and we see this woman's body lying on the ground, light giving off a little bit, the priest saying the last rites, and a shovel of dirt about to be poured onto the body. And then the very last plate, will she live again? The fading light. Is there any hope for truth in this world? Now, Goya would continue to make some of the most extraordinary etchings. He moved away from overt political, social commentary and did some absolutely powerful and beautiful pictures of bullfights, the power of the bull charging into the audience and killing a spectator. I mean, this is also something that is part of the brutality and the violence of everyday Spain at this time. And it's just shocking, extraordinary. And many of these are depictions of actual events that if he did not see himself, certainly heard of and knew of. The compositions of his work are absolutely exciting and unique for their drama. He made 33 prints and 320 copies made. And though it was not politically sensitive, it was not a commercial success. Again, it was probably just too real and not idealized enough. Again, in 1820, Goya falls ill, and he's nursed back to health with his doctor, Arietta. And to thank the doctor for helping him regain his health, he did this portrait of the doctor feeding him medicine. This is an extraordinary painting that's actually you can go see if you're ever in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I will never believe the shock I had to see this. Most of Goya's paintings are in Europe at the Prado in Spain. So to actually walk in and see a Goya, I was just like, oh my goodness, this is such an amazing painting. Because not only is this beautiful, tender moment of the doctor feeding him this medicine, him looking so forlorn and sick in that picture, barely holding on to the sheets of the blanket. And then in the background, these very shadowy figures, just obscured enough, some kind of evil or dark foreboding presence is pressing in on the scene. Absolute masterful painting. Goya, for the next years, resigned his commission at the royal court and lived outside of town in a small house. His wife had died earlier, and there alone he began to paint on the walls what become known as the black paintings, dark, foreboding images of human cruelty and barbarism and superstition. So he's 72 years of age now, and he still gets some royal commissions. But these paintings he painted directly onto the wall, as if he could not turn them away from, that he was going to live with these images every day for the rest of his life. Witchcraft, superstition, violence. These are perhaps the two most powerful images of his black paintings. This dog, strangely, is it looking over a wall, or has it been buried in the ground? Is it a symbol of something terribly cruel that's been done to the dog? The dog seems to have no agency or no ability to act in this world. It's such a simple image, and yet so poignant and so sad. And then the extreme violence of the Titan Kronos devouring his children. And you see him violently gripping this body and tearing into its flesh with his dumb, stupid look, oblivious to what he is doing to the future. In 1824, Goya asked and was allowed to leave Spain for France for health reasons. He lived in exile in the Bordeaux region for the last 4 years of his life. In that time, he did many drawings, and this one, in the last 2 years of his life, is one of my personal favorites. It says very simply, "Aún aprendo." I'm still learning. I sincerely hope that we could all say when we're 82 years old that we're still learning.